Delighted to see that we have a full house. That's wonderful. And given the speaker we have tonight, that does not surprise me. We're very pleased to have the Consul for Cultural Affairs with us, sitting in the front. So thank you so much for coming. It's my great pleasure to introduce Lola Jiménez Blanco, if I can call you Lola instead of María Dolores officially. I first met Lola last year at the wonderful exhibit that she curated at the Reina Sofia Art Museum in Madrid on Spanish art of the early Franco period, specifically 1939 to 1954. I was there to participate in the related lecture series on culture in post-war Spain, which is a topic that continues to fascinate me. Lola kindly gave me a personal private guided tour of her show, and the 2 full hours, I think it was, that you gave to me were not enough for her to say all there was to say about such a varied and innovative exhibit. I'm delighted that Lola plans to use her time here with us at NYU this semester as the holder of the King Juan Carlos Chair of Spanish Culture and Civilization to write a major monograph on art of the Spanish post-war period. And I can't wait to see that book. You probably can't wait to see it either. While she's here, Lola is teaching what's proved to be an extremely popular graduate course on art and power in the time of dictatorships, which brings together particularly students from the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, of which I'm the chair, and also students from the Institute of Fine Art. And we always like it when we can bring together students from different parts of NYU. Lola's also going to be organizing a conference at the King Juan Carlos Center later this semester, so watch this space. Lola is professor of art history at the Universidad Complutense in Madrid. She's a member of the Royal Board of Trustees of the Prado Museum and of the Technical Committee of the Andalusian Center of Contemporary Art in Seville. She edited the guide to the Prado Museum, which is no mean task, and has been a research assistant at the Guggenheim Museum here in New York and at the Phillips Collection in Washington. She's published 9 books. The first, which was, I believe, the result of her PhD dissertation in 1989, was already on the relation between art and power, Arte y Estado en la España del siglo XX, Art and the State in 20th Century Spain. So in a way, it's curious, this often happens. You've circled back to that topic in your current work. I'll just give you the titles of her most recent books. 2004, Arte Español en Nueva York, Spanish Art in New York. 2008, Historias de los grandes coleccionistas de arte, Stories or Histories of Great Art Collectors. 2011, El Patrimonio Artístico del Congreso de los Diputados, The Artistic Patrimony of the Spanish Congress. 2013, El Coleccionismo de Arte en España, Spanish Art Collecting, and 2014, Una Historia del Museo en 9 conceptos, 9 concepts for a history of the museum. And, as I've already mentioned, the catalogue in 2016 of the exhibit on post-war Spanish art, which was titled Campo Cerrado, Arte y Poder en la Posguerra Española. Hard to translate that first part, Campo Cerrado, closed camp. It's taken from the first novel in Max Aub's series of novels, El Laberinto Mágico, written in exile on the Spanish Civil War and its aftermath. The subtitle, Art and Power in the Spanish Post-War. So for this, the first of the 2 public lectures that Lola will give us this semester, look out for the other one towards the end of semester, Lola is going to give us the benefit of her scholarship on the history of art collecting. Her title, as you can see, is The Perception of Spanish Art in America, A History of Changes. Welcome, Lola. We're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Joe Lavagni, for this kind and generous introduction and for welcoming me this semester into the Spanish and Portuguese department. And thank you, Laura Turegano, and the King Juan Carlos I of Spain Center at NYU for inviting me to join this fall in this very prestigious chair in New York University. It is a great opportunity, and I feel deeply honored. And thank you, Juan José Herrera de la Muela, Consul for Cultural Affairs at the Consulate General of Spain in New York. And thank you all, friends and colleagues, for being here this evening. My purpose today is to share some thoughts about the American perception of Spanish art and hopefully show you through a selection of images how relevant the Spanish example was for American art, especially at a time when it was in the process of defining an identity of its own. The Prado Museum was officially inaugurated in Madrid in 1819. Up until then, Spanish painting was virtually unknown outside Spain, keeping in line with a set of concepts traceable to 16th century Black legend. The idea of Spanish culture being only on the periphery of Europe prevailed in collectors, artists, writers, and philosophers such as Immanuel Kant, who, in his typological study of national characters entitled Anthropology from Pragmatic Point of View from 1798, described Spaniards as being a mixture of European and Arabian or Moorish blood with a dangerous national pride and with a taste that is partly non-European. According to Kant's vision, it was only logical that Spanish art and culture occupied a marginal secondary position, if not openly dissident from the classicist ideal model embodied mainly by Italian and French art. Spanish art was too Islamic, too backward, too retrogressively Catholic, and ironically, at the same time, too multiculturally hybrid. You can see that here too. You see the Giralda and then the Puerta del Perdón with its Baroque addings. So, therefore, it was too far from quintessentially European culture. International appreciation of Spanish art around 1800 was, of course, clearly determined by this view. Its dissident character, its disdain for what was unanimously conceived as excellence, was a clear hindrance in terms of its international consideration for the majority of academics or collectors. However, around 1820, this very notion of difference that singled out Spanish art as insolite, unusual, or exotic in the European context, even to the point of excluding it, would eventually reverse into one of its main assets. It is not by chance that it is with Romanticism that Spanish art became an interesting and stimulating example for French and British artists that were looking for a liberating disregard of academic norms. For Spanish art grew then, indeed, an alternative aesthetic avenue that consecrated freedom and diversity as a true alternative to essential European traditions. That was also, although later, the case in America, and very especially so. What, following the steps of American taste, was formerly regarded as a problem, Spanish art's peculiarity as a provincial deviation from ideal beauty, at some point started to appear as the main attraction of Spanish call for American artists and collectors. Why? Well, because it came to be appreciated as an art of its own, with very distinctive traits and characteristics, and as one could expect from a country with a very distinctive historic personality. And that was very attractive image for a young burgeoning nation like America, then defining its own identity, summing up very diverse legacies, a nation seeking its place in history precisely when that of Spain was in decline. In the 20th century, the value of freedom from canonical norms that had defined Spanish art for centuries in the eyes of international collectors became the central value of modern culture. This idea promoted a heroic vision of Spanish art that remained untouched, at least during the first half of the 20th century, ending only at the final decades of this century, when the concept of cultural and geographical identities began to evolve in a new globalized world. I mean, identities are no longer linked necessarily to geographic identities. So this is then a history of changes. Now, let's follow the itinerary of these changes. We might start by saying that in 19th century, the trip to Spain was not even close in attendance to the Grand Tour to Italy, but it offered some surprising rewards to the daring, adventurous few people who decided to take it. Of course, that somehow fantasized European discovery of Spanish art in the context of Romanticism opened the way to a first appreciation of Spanish culture in the United States too, as shown very clearly in Washington Irving's Tales of the Alhambra. But the true knowledge and appreciation of Spanish culture by American collectors and artists arrived only later, between 1860 and 1920. A chronological frame that might explain the specific meanings and connotations of this cultural approach. The period 1860 to 1920 was crucial both in American and Spanish history, and has its climax in 1898. For Spain, that specific year became a symbol of its final decline. The loss of Cuba and Philippines put an end to a long decadence, but for the United States, 1898 meant exactly the opposite. An era of a rapid economic growth known as the Gilded Age, which led the country to the status of international superpower. If the Cuban War or the Spanish-American War makes a dramatical climax in the political history of both countries, it is also a very important turning point in their cultural history, having a decisive influence in American collecting of Spanish art. Although it can be said that the prestige of Spanish Siglo de Oro, the Golden Century, was already established among the most progressive cultural American elites, the Cuban War opened the eyes of collectors and artists alike to Spanish art and culture from a different perspective. Spanish culture displayed before them with all its richnesses and shortages, so that they could admire its brilliant past while conscious of the present rivalry. It takes a lot of nerve to talk about that with Professor Kagan and Susan Stratton sitting in the in the audience. So, by 1898, Spain took shape in American imagination, fed by a mixture of literary and historical sources as a mysterious, exotic, and attractive place. It was culturally an atypical country, midway between East and West, we just said that, between Europe, America, and Africa, always picturesque and poor, but full of ruins of Christian and Islamic culture, and very proud of its history. It was commonly accepted that the discovery of America in 1492, with its subsequent control of relevant parts of American continent, rocketed Spain to the position of world-leading economy, also paving the way to a century of blooming culture. Velázquez, Zurbarán, or Murillo, but also Cervantes, Quevedo, or Góngora, were part of the so-called Golden Century that came just after the climax of this state of affairs. And it was not in vain that during the Gilded Age, the young American nation fully discovered the culture of that old empire. Moreover, it was not in vain that it happened precisely then, when America was growing to a flourishing new power at the expenses of Spanish colonies. First Texas, California, and Florida, then later Cuba and Puerto Rico. As in a distant echo of Roman takeover of Greece, to possess the Spanish treasures confirmed the switch that was taking place in the political field. Indeed, the opposite poles of admiration and contempt, of attraction and disgusts and disgust that marked the way in which Spain was perceived by Americans in 19th century, especially around 1898, were part of the cultural backdrop in which the great American art collections emerged, and also part of the context in which their interest in Spanish art arose. This is then, as it has always been when we speak about collecting, a history of power. Love of art gradually gained ground among a class of newly rich citizens that emerged as a result of the United States' vertiginous economic growth around the turn of the 20th century. And in general terms, they were willing to emulate European aristocracy. Those early collectors did not favor local artists. They saved their risky bets for fields other than art. Instead, they preferred solid values, so they chose European artists of the past. They usually collected Italian and French masters, and sometimes Dutch and Flemish paintings too. Spanish artists were only very rarely among them, but around 1900, a handful of very refined, sophisticated collectors took a pioneer attitude towards the new. Somehow attracted to uncharted territories, they changed these conservative collecting practices and criteria to the point that they embraced Spanish artists, even if they were considered still by many as outsiders of mainstream European culture only a few years earlier, or maybe precisely because it was so. Arthur Milton Huntington was, of course, one of them. Initially inspired by romantic literary views of Spain, Huntington was a true champion of the Spanish cause, to which he devoted his entire life. He traveled to Spain and published extensively about Spanish and Portuguese art and literature, and his goal was way beyond collecting, as he's especially well known as the founder of the Hispanic Society of America in 1904. This institution is described as, I quote, a free public library, museum, and educational institution containing objects of artistic, historic, and literary interest, end of quote. And the purpose of the institution was, I quote again, advancement of the study of the Spanish and Portuguese languages, literature, and history, and advancement of the study of the countries wherein Spanish and Portuguese are or have been spoken languages, end of quote. He wanted to achieve, in his own words, as I said, I quote again, a poem of a museum, end of quote. And we may safely say that he gathered the best collection of Spanish treasures outside Spain, as it included not only painting and sculpture, but all sorts of manifestations of Spanish culture, including ceramic, decorative arts, furniture, etc. The Havemeyer, Louisine, and Henry Osborne were also very influential in this shift, in this change of outlook towards the Spanish art, up to some point encouraged in turn by American Impressionist painter Mary Cassatt, who spent several years in Spain. The Hagemeyers were always thoroughly modern and independent in their choices, which was considerably risky at a time when no catalogue raisonné could guarantee their acquisitions. This included both French Impressionism and Spanish artists that had inspired it, such as Goya, and some pieces that were considered by them the gems of the collection, as Las Majas en el Balcón, have later on be disattributed to the painter. They did not hesitate to travel to Spain in search of hidden treasures, and with the same enthusiasm that Louisine pioneered women vote as a prominent suffragette, they also pioneered the appreciation of El Greco among American collectors, as Louisine found in him the visionary free qualities of modern art, the qualities that she wanted to foster or to inspire in American art. Soon after Huntington and the Hagemeyers, Henry Clay Frick, one of the most exquisite New York collectors, started to collect major works by Velasquez, Goya, and El Greco. This Greco was purchased on the advice of the Havemeier, for instance. This happened in the first decade of the 20th century already, and the fact that Frick did acquire these works meant that Spanish art was by then a safe bet. It was only logical that as collectors became interested in Spanish works of art around 1900, American artists should also have developed growing curiosity in and appreciation for things Spanish. Many of the most important names in American art at the time visited Spain to gain first-hand experience of Spanish art. So did Thomas Eakins, Mary Cassatt, John St. Sargent, William Mary Chase, and Robert Henry. And although he never traveled to Spain, Whistler, as well, was a keen connoisseur of Spanish painting of the Golden Age. The importance of these names gives an idea of how significantly the Spanish legacy influenced the course of American painting. But Spanish art is not monolithic, and the preferences steadily evolved among the broad range of Spanish artists in keeping with the concerns and aims of new American painting. Halfway through 19th century, when realism gathered momentum and it was possible to gain first-hand experience, as I said, of Spanish art, traveling to Spain, Velasquez became the main focus of attention, of admiration among Spanish artists. Diego Velázquez seemed to them, as he did to Manet in 1865, to be a brilliant example to follow on account of his uninhibited painterly technique of allowing the brushstrokes to show through, or his amazing ability to capture visual reality, and his absolutely unconventional manner of treating his models equally. They were kings or jesters. The American realist Thomas Eakins discovered Velázquez in Madrid in 1869, and the impression he received is made visible in the Thinker, the portrait of Louis N. Kenton of 1900, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Similarly, the works of James Abbott McNeill Whistler, who was able to admire Velázquez in Paris and London collections, is so visibly indebted to this artist that critics coined, looking at his works, the term of Whistlaskian, like in the middle of Whistler and Velázquez. Indeed, some of Whistler's paintings can be seen as a variation or commentary on those of Velázquez. For instance, this happens in this artist studio, now in the Art Institute of Chicago. And of course, it can be very easily linked, as you see, with Las Meninas, two Las Meninas. The same can be said of the daughters of Edward Dudley Boyd in the Museum of Fine Art in Boston, painted in 1882 by John St. Sargent, and we were lucky enough to see it in the Museo del Prado some years ago too. Sargent visited the Prado as well and made copies of Velázquez's work, including Las Meninas and Las Hilanderas, the Spinners, and he continued his travels to Andalusia and Morocco, an experience that gave rise to countless drawings of exotic figures, but also scenes of flamenco dancing that he subsequently used to create his first monumental work, El Jaleo, now in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. Arguably, this is the most compelling image of a Spanish theme painted by an American. It was not by chance that when it was first shown at that year's Salon, the critics unanimously underlined Sargent's quality as a reviver of Spanish tradition in general and of Velázquez in particular. William Mary Chase also traveled to Spain. He did so in 1882, 83, 84, 96, and 1905, and curiously noted that every Velázquez reminded him of Whistler. During his visit to the Prado Museum, he made copies of his portrait of Philip IV, the philosophers Menippus and Aesopus, and also the Spinners. Velázquez's influence can be seen in such works as the oil painting Alice in the Synagogue Studio in 1901, but also in the pastel that we have here, Hall at Shinnecock, in the Terra Foundation for the Arts in Chicago, whose asymmetrical composition in turn recalls Sargent's aforementioned daughters of Edward Dudley Boyd. This would indicate, of course, that one of the reasons why Chase appreciated Spanish school was for its influence on contemporary American art. But Chase, as other American painters, was also fascinated by what he saw outside the Prado Museum, as we can see with this Carmencita. The younger Robert Henry traveled to Madrid in various occasions to see Velasquez's work too. Henry, master of a new generation of New York realists, the standard bearer of the fight against academicism in the early years of the 20th century, mentions Velasquez's name on numerous occasions in his book, The Art Spirit. In some of these references, this name is associated with such concepts as dignity or attitude towards the model, and by extension, attitude towards life. For Henry, then, Velasquez was not only an aesthetical model, but also an ethical model. This explains why Robert Henry's work not only borrows from formal aspects from Velasquez paintings, such as his sober brown palettes, but also his interest in painting all facets of life with the same dignity. Even those which, however insignificant or disdainful, were generally avoided as artistic subjects. Already at the end of the 19th century, another Spanish painter began to interest American artists. It was Francisco de Goya, the last of the great masters, but also the man who ushered in modern age, with his artistic freedom and personal views, and with his commitment to reality and to his own time. Greatly admired earlier by French romantics and realists, Goya's prints also led to his becoming rapidly known in the United States. And at the end of the 19th century, artists like John Singer Sargent advised collectors like George Vanderbilt, for instance, to purchase Goya's prints in Madrid. The painter John Sloan, as well, a member of the revolutionary group of the Eight, also known as the Ashcan School on account of its preference for harsh themes of American everyday life, received a set of aquatints by Goya from his friend and master Robert Henry in 1900. We can see here too also to what extent Goya was a reference for his harsh blacks and his unbeaten realism. But the social commitment that American artists admired in Goya was also apparent in this painter by Sorolla, another Otra Margarita, a social theme that was a far cry from the brilliant and colorist mature Sorolla that we can see here in Después del Baño, after the bath. Another Marguerite was the first picture to be publicly shown in the United States. The first picture by Sorolla. The year was 1893, and the setting was the World's Columbia Exposition in Chicago, an excellent showcase for his presentation to collectors and public at large. After that, his art became increasingly luminous, and his rising career reached its peak precisely in the United States. Sorolla, there's no doubt that the Sorolla exhibition in 1909, held at the Hispanic Society of America, was a landmark in his career and assured his critical fortunes not only in the States but also internationally, worldwide. This exhibition marked the start of a collaboration of several years between magnate and painter that resulted in a series of mural paintings on the Spanish regions that can be seen at the Hispanic Society, permanently at the Hispanic Society. Those murals portrayed Spain as a country full of light and color, whose trades and festive costumes conveyed a positive and greatly appealing image, a far cry from the dark, backwards, and decadent image of Spain that we were describing at the beginning of this talk. The commission to paint portraits of such prominent Americans as the famous jeweler and artist Louis Comfort Tiffany, who bought also several works by Sorolla, and for instance the commitment to paint the portrait of President Taft. Now it was painted in 1909, and now it is in the Taft Museum in Cincinnati, give an idea of Sorolla's soaring fame in the United States. But his work was not only appreciated by collectors and patrons. Sorolla also developed friendship based on mutual admiration with contemporaries John St. Sargent and William Mary Chase, the two most internationally acclaimed American painters of the age. They shared the respect for Velasquez, free brushstroke, and elegant coloring, as we can see in this self-portrait. Sorolla pointed this out when, while viewing works by these American artists in Paris in 1900, exclaimed, and I quote, "Have you, American, conceived why you have such artists? It is because the real founder of American art was that first supreme impressionist master, Velasquez." End of quote. While Sorolla was admired in the United States as a painter of light, another Spanish artist soon appeared in the American scene who came to be considered as Sorolla's counterpoint. Zuluaga, you can see, Cristo de la Sangre, Ignacio Zuluaga, whose images depicted the country's, Spain's gloomiest atavistic and uncultured aspects, guided by the idea that recognizing the problems was the best means of achieving Spain's desired regeneration, as writers such as Unamuno or Valle-Inclán proposed in their books, writers of the generation of 98, Spanish generation of 98. In their opinion, whereas Sorolla, in the opinion of Unamuno or Valle-Inclán, whereas Sorolla merely painted Spain's superficial image, Zuluaga succeeded in capturing Spain's soul. The Hispanic Society also held an exhibition of Zuluaga's paintings in 1909, and the catalog was prefaced by William Mary Chase. American critics praised Zuluaga as a reviver of Spanish Golden Age painting or as a continuer of romantic scenes and types, but the public did not really receive so well the harsh content of his paintings. However, although Zuluaga did not enjoy the same social success as Sorolla's, his work soon found its way to American collections. He also struck up relationship with American painters of his day, and Robert Henry regarded Zuluaga as, and I quote, "undoubtedly the greatest Spanish painter of the day," end of quote. Henry found in Zuluaga's rough Castilian types a modern adaptation of the dignity he himself admired in Velasquez's model. Furthermore, Zuluaga played a prominent role in introducing American collectors to El Greco, for instance, the Havemeyer. So, for the first time, a painting by El Greco in Zuluaga's atelier in Paris. But at the same time that Sorolla and Zuluaga were producing a type of work that can be seen as the last homage to Spanish school of the Golden Century, Paris and other European cities were witnessing the emergence of other artistic forms that were regarded as radical break with tradition, or at least as an alternative way to it. These were the so-called avant-garde movements, which began to pose new challenges to convention in the name of a new, supreme, and unquestionable value: freedom. Many Spanish artists, headed by Picasso, took part in or even led these movements. And once again, American artists and collectors felt their impact. And by the way, let's not forget that Picasso was a great admirer of Velázquez, Goya, and El Greco, all of whom he considered his presidents. An American collector, the famous writer Gertrude Stein, turned out to be crucial in the initial rise of Picasso. In 1906, Stein purchased several works by Picasso, which hung in her Rue de Fleurus apartment walls, along with not only his contemporary Matisse, but also with earlier masters ranging from Toulouse-Lautrec to Cézanne or Renoir. This way, Picasso made a definite step from being a young, promising artist from Montmartre to entering the circle of the leading names. The creator of Cubism, together with Braque, throughout his life, Picasso would advocate for a new, free way to approach the rendering of real life in art, something that Gertrude Stein was also trying to achieve herself in her own writings. She found a sort of solidarity in Picasso's work as much as herself was doing in the field of literature. So for her, Picasso seemed to epitomize an unprejudiced break with tradition. This perception, this idea of Picasso as a radical breaker of tradition, may have caused that there was not one single work by Picasso in the Metropolitan Museum up until 1946. It was exactly this painting, the portrait of Gertrude Stein, the first one to enter precisely in the Metropolitan Museum. It was donated to the museum by Gertrude Stein, friend and heir, Aristocracy. Yet long before 1946, Picasso's work was very present in New York scenes through other means. In the little galleries of the Photo Secession, for instance, in 291 in Fifth Avenue, the photographers Alfred Stieglitz and Edward Steichen displayed works by Picasso as early as the beginning of the 20th century, as early as 1915, notably along, and this is very important, notably along with non-European art. From there, Picasso's work acted as a stimulus from early American avant-garde artists. So much so that it would be impossible to understand Max Weber, Joseph Stella, Marsden Hartley, Patrick Henry Bruce, Lionel Feininger, or Stuart Davis's works without considering Picasso's Cubism. But from 1929 onwards, it was chiefly a Manhattan museum, the recently founded Museum of Modern Art, that championed and disseminated Picasso's work at the militant initiative of its director, Alfred H. Barr, Jr. Given the central importance of this museum in creating a narrative for modern art, this fact contributed decisively to Picasso's becoming acclaimed as the indisputable avant-garde hero. From the outset of this institution, the director, Alfred Barr, paid special attention to Picasso as the founder of Cubism and therefore, and by extension, as the embodiment of the supreme value of modernity, as I said, freedom. By the end of the 30s, the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, began to permanently show Picasso's diversity, Picasso's work, but emphasizing two fundamental paintings, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon and Guernica, Demoiselles d'Avignon 1907, Guernica 1937. As happened with Velasquez before, Picasso was hailed by young artists as both an aesthetical and an ethical example. For the members of the New York school, such as Pollock, de Kooning, Motherwell, or Rothko, Picasso stood for the legitimacy of personal experimentation above any authoritarian rules. The fertilizer influence of Picasso, as Dory Ashton called it, on the cultural impulse of New York school of the 40s is, of course, a commonplace in modern art history. Jackson Pollock, the great exponent of the New York abstract expressionism, a movement that was identified by Irving Sandler as the triumph of American painting, illustrates this in such work as She-Wolf, painting in 1943, where the imprint of El Greco may also be suggested. A whole stage in the work of Arshile Gorky bears the literal imprint of Picasso, but the same artist paid equal attention to Joan Miró, for instance, for his organic forms and intense colors, but also for his liberating connection with the unconscious. This was particularly important for abstract expressionists who conceived painting as a record of the external expression of an interior life of the artist. And this was done precisely with a technique very close to automatic surrealist automatism. During the war and post-war period, the intellectual environment of that group of artists in New York embraced the cause of the Spanish Republic. In this context, Picasso and Miró were equally admired, both for this steadfast adherence to freedom in art, as for the steadfast adherence to the fight against fascism. Miró's exhibition at the MoMA in 1941, held at the throes of World War II, and the presence of Guernica in the museum in the MoMA since 1939, held there in New York until Spain would have a democracy, also had a moral significance for them. Some American artists later explicitly exposed the cause of the Spanish Republic. Such was the case, of course, of Robert Motherwell, who produced a series of paintings entitled Homage to the Spanish Republic. But other artists of the same generation, such as Philip Gaston, drew on images from Spanish tradition to denounce moral wasteland. The blackest of Goya's work, dark not only in the sense of color, thus became for him a fertile reference. For Gaston, Goya's anti-classicism was synonymous of free expression, and his allusions to the prevailing darkness in 18th and 19th century Spain had an obvious and ironic parallel in the hooded heads that he was painting in the New York of the late 60s, which in turn denounced the darkness of American present. And last but not least, and perhaps as a counterpart, we should probably mention the presence of Salvador Dali in the United States and in the 30s and 40s, a presence that accounts for his shrewd realization of the artistic potential of consumer society and mass media, and whose influence on American art was subsequently witnessed in the pop art movement by artists such as Andy Warhol, for instance. But this is a whole other story. So in short, to sum up, we could say that Spanish example has always been related not only to specific artistic forms, but also to some attitudes that determine the nature of American modern art. In 19th century, Spanish art emerged as an independent avenue free from the academic canons that rule art and culture in Europe, and these values were to be seen to be epitomized chiefly by Velasquez and then by El Greco and Goya. This fact, the fact that their work is so distinctively different, indicate that their appeal was beyond formal aspects, even if they were also very important. In 20th century, when a new, modern, and quintessentially American art was emerging, with a steady desire of self-affirmation in front of a restrictive norm increasingly regarded as alien to American expression of life, Spanish artists were regarded by their American colleagues as their advocates of their freedom, and that was not only for his decisive contribution to avant-garde. This is important, not only for formal aspects. It is not by chance that Paul Éluard, the French surrealist poet who wrote the most moving, compelling poem about freedom under Nazi occupation of Paris, was chosen to write a preface for the catalogue of a Picasso exhibition in New York at Kurt Valentine Galleries years later. It was not by chance either that the title he chose for this text was Picasso, Good Master of Liberty. Thank you very much.
With regard to Sorolla, I've always been surprised that there hasn't been all that much interest in him in this country. I mean, I know that here in New York we have great collections of him, but in other museums there just isn't that much. I mean, is it because he's so much of his collection is in Spain, or?
No, well, yeah, but
There
are a lot of paintings by Sorolla in New York museums and in American museums, not only in New York, but in Boston, in San Diego, in many other places.
Yeah, no. I mean, but still, I mean, he's not a household name.
No, I know.
And he should be.
We have to take into account that, Sorolla's fame was, a huge phenomenon in 1909, even a little earlier, but then his fame declined also in Spain too. I mean, as soon as avant-gardes were, becoming more in fashion, painters like Sorolla and Zuloaga were not so much, on display, on view in museums anymore. However, now we're having in the last, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 years, we're having like a kind of revival of Sorolla. We're having a number of exhibitions in Madrid, in Valencia, his hometown, and I think that also in the Hispanic Society, the whole gallery that I just showed with the Vision of Spain has been restored and it's now visible, in all splendor. So.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
but
but
still,
still
I
it's
mean, I
not.
say, in the
Yeah,
Hispanic society and in Spain, he's
I
well
know.
known. But the reason I ask this is I wonder what's his style. I mean, he's not an impressionist. Is
Not
he a
exactly.
I mean, he's sort of difficult to pinpoint in the history of art.
How would you qualify Sargent? It's more or less the same thing. It's more or less
Mm.
the same thing. They
Mm.
were doing the same long brushstroke. They were regarding the same references in the past. As I
Mm.
said, Velasquez. They were very, I don't know, interested in what was happening in his own time in Paris or London, but they were not exactly impressionists. They were also very much, concerned with all that had to do with light and with the rendering of light. Of course, Sorolla's best known images are those of the beaches in Valencia. All these images
Yeah.
with the light and coming through the water, etc., etc. So they have common traits with Impressionists, but their brushstroke, the technique is not Impressionist at all. I mean, not at all.
Thank you.
I think it would be very interesting if you were to continue. I mean, it was a very interesting lecture. Thank you. But I think that looking in the 19th century, also at Fortuny
Of
had
course,
an,
of course.
an immensely important
Of
role
course,
here,
of course.
and
I-
was and what.
I erased that at the last moment.
But you
because
erased
it.
it.
Was too
Oh, what
long.
a shame.
But yeah, but
what
you know.
what makes me so interested in Fortuny is that his American, not only his American collectors, but also so many artists who are now more or less forgotten, were Fortuny. Well, even somebody like Willie Merritt Chase was tremendously interested in Fortuny, and
Yeah.
lots and lots of other. He really sparked an Orientalist fervor
Yeah.
in America, and was perhaps as important in his time as Sorolla.
This is true.
And
But, this is true. Fortuny was in fact very important, and he had also a dealer that was very influential in that, and he was very present in American collections, and. Of course, for the sake of the argument, it was good to, counterpose Sorolla and Zuluaga and all these things. But Fortuny is very, very important and should be also taken into account absolutely in this narration, of course.
A very quick question. Did you mention that Huntington and Havemeyer traveling to Spain?
Yeah.
Did Frick also travel to Spain?
Frick? No.
No, never.
No. No, but Frick didn't do, he didn't buy his things there. He didn't, I mean, no.
He was in Seville, he was in Granada, Madrid.
Well, yeah, he went with the Carnegies. This is true. He went with the Carnegies with his photograph with the Carnegies. Yeah, but I think he did all his acquisitions. I mean, he wasn't as daring as the Havemayers were in terms of getting into this uncharted territory and buying things that were by then not really well known or well studied. That in that sense, I think, I mean, it's a different approach. I think that the Havemayers were like opened the way, and then the Frick and other collectors came later. I think that's very clear to me. I don't know if this is, of course, he went to Spain, he did things, but I mean, he did not exactly did the same thing as the Havemayers did, as going to Granada, going to Toledo, going to all the places that Louisine explains in her wonderful book 16 to 60. I think that it's a very different thing, and also Huntington's trip to Spain, although it has also been somehow romanticized very much. I think it was also very important in the sense that it was very much a study trip. I mean, he was preparing himself because he went to Spain, and I mean, I think it was really something that was willing to open the way for a new idea of Spain in the States. Yeah. Yeah.
Would you be able to tell us a little about how Mrs. Gardner in Boston was able to acquire El Jaleo?
Well, maybe, maybe Professor Kagan would do that better than I will. So we can bring the.
It was acquired.
Yeah.
The Jaleo. She of course went she's a pioneer. She was one of the.
Of course.
She went to Spain in 1891, 1992, hung around in Seville and Madrid. She loved the place, and there's a whole wonderful scrapbook of her pictures from Seville, which you call the most dreamy place on earth. Very romantic. It was after it was purchased in Paris by a relative, a man named Coolidge.
Yes.
It was brought back to the United States
this is
and
true.
was
I have
hidden.
that
No one saw it. It was once put on view at an exhibition at the Athenaeum in Boston in the late 80s for a couple of months and disappeared from view. And he held on to it all of his life until about 1912, 1914. She was always trying to get a hold of it, and only was when she built the Spanish chapel at her house in Boston, that Coolidge finally let go of it and basically gave it to her which is now the centerpiece of the Spanish chapel.
And the Spanish chapel is also an interesting thing that we might somehow describe here, just to give an idea of how eclectic this idea of what was Spanish at the time. I mean, of course, there are a number of things that are not coming from Spain, but they give this idea of somehow Moorish, exotic, and eccentrical thing. If we contrapose that to the mainstream European taste,
right.
That's very interesting to say too.
I mean, it goes. There's a very strong Mexican component.
Of
All
course,
the tiles
of course,
there
of course.
Mexican, and has to do with the whole discovery of Hispanic culture. And that's one of my. I guess that's my question. I think, and remember, I'm a historian. I'm not an art historian. And
we have
the discovery of Spanish art goes hand in hand with the discovery of Spanish architecture.
Sure.
William Dean Howells in 1909 said there's no better modern literature than the Spanish, and he was thinking of Vasco Ibáñez. And particularly books like The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which essentially reached a far greater public than a few paintings that nobody ever saw. They were in.
Well, yes, and we don't have to forget also that Blasco Ibáñez was also working in Hollywood, and he was very much.
Made movies.
Made movies.
In the sense, it's part and parcel of I think it's a wider phenomenon.
Yeah.
But your chronology is precisely correct. In the sense, it's gains ground in the late 19th century, comes to the fore in the early 20th century. And I think one of the collectors who really says it, and who you didn't mention, who's the most rapacious of them all, is William Randolph Hearst, who
of course,
buys furniture and monasteries. But he has a notion of, to the victors belong the spoils. And after he went to Spain, he said, it's a place that this country no longer, in fact, is all of Europe, because of World War I, doesn't deserve to hold on to its artistic treasures. It's better to have them in a country that will preserve them.
Yeah.
Or individuals that preserve them,
of course.
Namely himself.
That's why I said this was a history of power, as it always is. It's exactly that. And that was also very much so around Cuba in the Philippines. That moment, Spain was, in decline. America was soaring as an international power. And of course, William Randolph Hearst, which is not my ideal model of collector, I may say, was very much the one who was saying all these things, and the one who was writing that, of course, and he was somehow right, that Spanish authorities and Spanish collectors did not make anything to retain their own things. I mean, they don't have any laws to protect the patrimony. They don't have any interest in protecting it. So he was taking advantage of that, of course. Yeah.
Hola, Lola. Thank you for your talk. My question is, if you were to continue the history of Spanish art in the U.S., what would you include after Dalí? Regardless of Pedro Almodóvar and the craze for tapas, would you? I was thinking of Esteban Vicente, perhaps because we're in New York City.
Guerrero
but what would you?
Was here. Esteban Vicente and Guerrero are always cited in Spain as members of the New York School. I don't know if they're so well known here as so often happens. Well, there were many other artists that have been painting in New York in the last, in the last decades. You know that the big change that happened in Spain after the death of Franco is that the country opened internationally, and of course New York was very much attracting artists from all over the world. So we have artists from all points of Spain, from Catalonia, from Madrid, from Basque Country, from wherever, that are now today working in New York precisely. It will be, they are uncountable. So, but for instance, I may mention, I don't know, Manolo Valdés, I may mention Manuel Lledós, I may mention, so many others.
Hi, thank you so much for that great talk. I was curious about whether you could look into, because a lot of this is about Spanish artists in New York City. My hunch is that in that context, the Spanish artists were seen as Hispanic, right?
Yeah.
And this is the moment when you have the growth of Hispanic communities. And I'm using Hispanic because of the places like El Diario or Colonias Hispanas. That's how it was, it was not Latino so much as Hispano, to highlight the Spanish language as the commonality among Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and all of the other Latin American migrants that were coming at the turn of the century. So I wondered if you have any glimpse about how these artists were perhaps seen as or confused, right? Or to the extent to which their Spanishness or Spaniard national identity was distinguished from Latin Americans at the time?
I think they were somehow distinguished, but they were somehow in the same place also. I mean, it could be contradictory, but it's exactly like that. For instance, you have to take into account that Huntington's interest for Spain became, was really strong through Mexico. I mean, he started through Mexico. He started, collecting things also from other places, from Latin America, etc., etc. And but I think that painters such as Sorolla or such as, I don't know, Velasquez, or such as precisely the painters that I brought today, maybe they were more specifically perceived as coming from Europe, coming from Spain. I think that they very much so, because they were all, traced positioned in this thread of history from the Golden Century, and I think they were very much perceived as coming from the other side of Europe. I mean, they were not coming from the mainstream center of the ideal beauty, which was Italian art, French art. They were like the dissident part of Europe, but very much Europe. Although at the same time, as I said, we have to think that collectors like Huntington were looking at Spanish art at the same time that they were looking at, Latino or South American art. William Randolph Hearst was mentioned earlier, and it was almost the same thing. I mean, he was also in his huge house in California. He was mixing everything. He was very eclectic, and so, in architecture, as Professor Kagan mentioned, maybe the mixture was richer. I mean, it was much more, I don't know, in California specifically, what was called Spanish style, and it's also no chance that it was done there because the climate is similar, the landscape is similar, so they were mixing very much, all sorts of traits from Mexico or from many other places with what was supposed to be from Spain, that was chiefly Andalusian, but also sometimes, other parts of Spain. So it's somehow a difficult question to ask because it's yes and no at the same time.
Hi, great talk. Could you comment on the political influence of this art? There are Spanish artists in, let's say, the U.S. For example, Picasso is a good example. This Guernica had probably more influence from the political point of view than maybe you can comment if he had more influence from the political point of view or the Cubist or artistic point of view. But could you just...
Yeah, well, I will take advantage of that question to announce that my next lecture will be on Picasso, on the Guernica and abstract expressionism, precisely. But Guernica, of course, was very clearly a political, moral stand for American painters of the time, for New York school. Guernica was not only something about Cubism or Surrealism or the mixture of both, but it was more than anything else a cry against fascism, a cry against the war, a cry against injustice. So that's why Guernica became a symbol, not only related to Spanish Civil War, but related to all sorts of wars. It was at the Museum of Modern Art until 1981 when it came to Spain. I was going to say return, but not return, but it was never before in Spain. When it finally came to Spain was 1981, and that was because it was agreed that the democratic regime that was the transitional democratic regime that was in Spain it was agreed that it was already firm and established. So that was also a political statement from the international community to support democracy in Spain. But Guernica was there and very much had also a decisive influence in another sense. Painters of the abstract expressionism were abstract painters, and they were trying to defend the idea that you could do a very politically committed art without being, without rendering, real life. You don't have to paint people. You don't have to paint a fist. You don't have to paint, the traits, the visual traits of reality as it is. You don't need to have a painting that is exactly the same as Soviet propaganda to be committed. You really had to be free and to have to be committed to yourself in order to really make a real political commitment. This is the lesson of Guernica. Guernica was free in the forms because it was free also in the content, because it was a fight for freedom. So the lesson of Picasso to the abstract expressionist painters was exactly that. You could be committed. They were dying to be committed to their own time. Pollock, Rothko, all of them were really willing to make a difference with their art. They were not willing to be, decorative art. They were really willing to make a statement about their own time. And Picasso showed them that they could do it without renouncing of being modern, of being, free in the forms. That is the real lesson of Guernica in terms of in artistic terms. But also, as I said, it stood there in the MoMA up until 1981 to remind people of every war, of every injustice, of every killing of innocent people. This was very much a political stand.
I think we should move to the reception now, and that's perfect because